Silence is the most expensive thing they sell at Lumiere, and the staff learns quickly that their job is to maintain it. But the night a hedge fund CEO decided to humiliate a quiet waitress using the one language he assumed she couldn't possibly know, the silence he shattered was his own. Sera Okafor had been working the evening shift at Lumiere for 14 months. She knew the weight of a reedal crystal stem by feel alone. She knew which tables caught a draft from the kitchen doors in winter. She knew how to pour a 2011 Barolo without letting the sediment disturb, how to smile with her eyes when her mouth was too tired to mean it, and how to make herself functionally invisible to people who preferred their service staff that way. Most of them preferred it that way. Lumiere was the kind of restaurant in Chicago where reservations required a referral, the kind where the menu had no prices, because if you needed to ask, you were already in the wrong room. The dining room glowed amber from recessed lighting and the low flicker of real beeswax candles. The carpet was so thick it absorbed footsteps entirely, which meant conversations carried, which meant Sera heard everything. She had learned, in these 14 months, not to listen. Before Lumiere, before the white apron and the sensible black flats she replaced every 4 months, Sera had been something else entirely. She had been the kind of student her professors mentioned in the same breath as graduate fellowships and academic futures. She had completed her master's degree in molecular gastronomy at the Culinary Institute of America with a thesis on fermentation chemistry that a French food science journal had requested permission to excerpt. She had been 2 semesters into her PhD program at Cornell when her mother was diagnosed. Not a mild diagnosis. Not the kind you manage with an adjusted schedule and a good support system. Pauline Okafor had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition attacking her nervous system with the deliberate efficiency of something that had been planning the assault for years. The specialists in Cleveland were precise with their numbers. They were considerably less precise about the outcome. Sera had done the math on a Tuesday evening in October, sitting at her kitchen table in Ithaca with her laptop open to her Cornell student account and a stack of medical billing statements beside it. The PhD stipend did not cover the gap. The family savings did not cover the gap. Nothing covered the gap except Sera herself, so she had withdrawn from the program, packed her apartment into a storage unit, and moved back to Chicago to be close to her mother and the medical team managing her care. The manager at Lumiere had hired her within 20 minutes of her interview. Sera Okafor carried herself like someone who had never been uncertain of a room, and she had memorized their wine list before she even came in. She needed the money. She took the job. She learned to be invisible. On the night in question, the reservation for table 11 arrived at 7:45. Lumiere's host, a composed young man named Patrick, who had been doing this for 6 years and was unflappable by design, greeted them at the door and walked them back with the Samsung dignitaries to a private audience. The man at the center of the party was Preston Greer. Sera recognized him the way you recognize someone you've only ever seen in print, the particular quality of a face you've categorized as belonging to a category rather than a person. Preston Greer, 41 years old, founding partner of Greer Aldrich Capital Management, a hedge fund that had made its reputation on aggressive acquisition strategies and a well-documented willingness to dismantle whatever it bought. He had been profiled in Bloomberg twice in the last 3 years. Both profiles had used the word ruthless and framed it as a compliment. He was flanked by 2 people. To his left sat a woman Sera placed immediately, Dr. Ingrid Solberg, the Norwegian biotech entrepreneur who had quietly become one of the most influential investors in the Great Lakes region. She was 60, silver-haired, and had the unhurried attention of someone who had seen enough people like Preston Greer to find them interesting the way you find a predictable chemical reaction interesting. To his right sat a man Sera didn't recognize, younger, expensively dressed, with the slightly rigid posture of someone working hard to appear relaxed. Sera approached the table. "Good evening, and welcome to Lumiere." Her voice was what it always was, warm, measured, professional. "I'm Sera, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you with still or sparkling water?" Preston Greer did not look up from his phone. "Still, and we'll need the wine list now, not at the usual point in the performance." "Of course." Sera produced the leather-bound list and set it carefully beside his elbow. "Does she know the list?" Greer said, still not looking at her, addressing Ingrid as if Sera were a feature of the table, rather than a person standing 18 inches away. Ingrid glanced at Sera with a faint, careful smile. "I imagine she does. We'll see." Greer finally looked up, his eyes doing the dismissive sweep that Sera had learned to absorb without reaction. "What's the best pairing for the Wagyu? Assuming I want something that won't embarrass me in front of my guest." Sera named 3 options, described them precisely, explained the tannin structures, and how they would interact with the fat content of the specific cut on the evening menu. She did this in approximately 90 seconds, and without referencing the list. Greer's expression did not change. "We'll do the Giacomo Contino Barolo. Make sure the sommelier handles the decant. I don't want it fumbled." Sera smiled. "I'll have Tomas take care of it personally." She walked away. She did not allow herself to feel the slight. She had stopped counting slights somewhere around month 3. Over the next hour, Preston Greer performed. There was no other word for it. He was auditioned, consciously or not, for Ingrid Solberg's approval, and the performance required a consistent supporting cast of people being less than him. The salmon amuse-bouche was described, loudly, as competent. He corrected Sera on the exact vintage of a wine she had named correctly. He told the younger man beside him, while Sera refilled water glasses, that the fundamental problem with the service industry was its complete inability to attract people with any real intellectual capacity, because people with real intellectual capacities, Ingrid said quietly, some people don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Greer said. Greer said, some people just don't have the drive to make the harder one. Sera's hand was steady on the water pitcher. It had to be. She thought about the drive to Cleveland she'd made last Thursday, the 4-hour round trip she fit between a Tuesday double shift and a Thursday opening. She thought about the stack of academic journals she still subscribed to. Because she could not make herself cancel the subscriptions, because cancelling them would mean something she was not ready to name. She thought about her mother's hands, which had been shaking more than usual lately. She carried the empty pitcher back to the service station. She replaced it. She breathed. The breaking point came during the entree course. Sera was setting down the Wagyu when Greer turned abruptly to make a point to the younger man beside him, his shoulder swinging wide and catching the edge of her forearm with enough force to shift the plate's trajectory by 2 inches. A thin ribbon of the truffle jus crossed the rim of Ingrid's plate and landed on the white tablecloth. The sound Greer made, a short, hard exhale of disgust, silenced the immediate vicinity. I apologize, Sera said immediately, reaching for the small cloth at her apron. Let me take care of that. You should be more careful, Greer said flatly. That's a fairly basic function of the job. Your arm caught my forearm as I was placing the dish, Sera said. She kept her voice entirely level. I want to make sure you have accurate information. Greer stared at her. It was the stare of a man who had not recently been contradicted by someone in a service position, and he was processing it the way a system processes unexpected input, with a brief, visible lag before the overriding program reasserted itself. "Accurate information," he repeated. He leaned back in his chair. He was embarrassed in front of Ingrid. Embarrassed in front of the younger man whose name Sera still didn't know. Embarrassed by a waitress who had not looked away. And so he did what people like Preston Greer do when they are embarrassed. He reached for the thing he was most confident would re-establish the hierarchy. He looked at Ingrid with a performance of weary amusement. Then he looked at Sera. "Ars longa, vita brevis," he said in the particular register of someone deploying a private joke. "Vita servorum brevissima." He smiled, the thin, self-congratulatory smile of a man who has just said something he believes no one else in the room can understand. Art is long, life is short. The life of servants is shortest of all. "I studied a bit of the classics," he said, for the benefit of the table. "Old habit, nothing our friend here needs to worry about." The younger man laughed. It was the laugh of someone who wasn't entirely sure what had been said, but understood that laughing was expected. She set down her fork, and Sera stood still. What happened inside her in the 3 seconds that followed was not anger exactly. It was something more specific than anger and considerably colder. It was the feeling of watching a man walk confidently onto terrain he had entirely misread. It was the particular recognition of someone who had spent 5 years studying food science chemistry, realizing, with sudden and absolute clarity, that the person in front of her had just mislabeled a compound and was about to defend the error with great confidence. Her doctoral dissertation, the one she had been 2 chapters from completing when she left Cornell, had been titled "The Rhetoric of Flavor: How the Roman Culinary Tradition Shaped European Gastronomic Philosophy." It had required, among other things, 2 years of studying classical Latin texts, specifically Apicius, Columella, and the dietary writings of Galen. Her thesis advisor had been a classicist who insisted that you could not understand the food without understanding the language. Sera understood the language. She straightened. The shift was small but complete, the same way a key changes position in a lock. She was no longer in the posture of a woman managing someone else's discomfort. She was, in the tided, to stop, managing it. She looked at Preston Greer with the steady, clinical attention of a scientist examining a data point. "Vita brevis ars longa," she said, very quietly. Her Latin was not the Latin of a prep school elective. It was the pronunciation of someone who had been corrected, repeatedly and rigorously, by a classicist with very little patience for approximations. "You inverted the Hippocratic aphorism. The original is from the Aphorismi of Hippocrates, rendered into Latin by Seneca. The life of servants portion, I should mention, is your own invention. Seneca would not have approved." The younger man stopped smiling. Greer's expression had gone very still. Sera did not stop, not because she was angry, but because she had started and the precision required finishing. "Qui sapit in totis, illi sapit rebus," she continued. She had to choose something he would feel, quod stultissimum est aliena inscientia niti ad gloriam. She paused just long enough for it to settle. Pliny the Elder, Natural History. The wise man is wise in all things. The most foolish act is to rely on another's ignorance for one's own glory. The room had gone quiet in that particular way that dining rooms go quiet, not silent, but attenuated, the conversations at adjacent tables as something registered, peripherally, that something was happening at table 11. Preston Greer opened his mouth. Nothing arrived. What happened next came from Ingrid Solberg, the biotech entrepreneur who had been watching with the focused stillness of someone doing an assessment she had not disclosed she was conducting, set her napkin on the table and looked at Sera with an expression that had moved, visibly, from careful neutrality to something that might have been the beginning of delight. "Quam bene," Ingrid said. She was smiling. My Latin is modest, but I know Pliny. She looked at Sera with direct, undisguised interest. You studied classics? Molecular gastronomy, Sera said. At Cornell, my dissertation examined Roman culinary philosophy. The classics were required. A beat. I had to leave the program. Family circumstances. Ingrid's expression registered something, the specific quality of a person recalibrating a situation. What was the focus of the dissertation? Sera told her. She described the fermentation research, the historical translation work, the specific argument she had been building in the 2 chapters she hadn't finished, the way that Roman attitudes toward preservation and flavor were a direct antecedent to certain contemporary techniques in food science that the field largely failed to credit correctly. She spoke for approximately 3 minutes. At some point, she became aware that she was no longer using her service voice. She was using her other voice, the one she had stored in a box for 14 months and forgotten she still had. Ingrid listened with the focused attention of someone who was not being polite. Preston Greer looked at the tablecloth. Who is your program advisor? Ingrid said. Was, corrected, Dr. Patricia Fenn, Cornell Food Science. I know Patricia. Ingrid said it the way people say things that are factually true and also carry a weight the other person should feel. I've funded 2 of her graduate fellowships. She studied Sera for a moment with the expression of a person who has just found something where she was not looking for it. Who is managing your mother's care, if you're comfortable telling me? Sera told her. The facility, the team, the current protocol, the specific gap in coverage that had made the situation what it was. Ingrid nodded slowly. She reached into the interior pocket of her blazer and produced a card, matte white, the name and contact information embossed rather than printed. She held it out across the table. My foundation funds a graduate completion fellowship specifically for researchers who have had to interrupt their work for caregiving. Ingrid said it simply, the way she might describe a feature of the restaurant. It covers tuition and a living stipend. More relevantly, it includes a comprehensive medical trust that extends to immediate family members. She paused. The current cohort is full, but I have discretionary placement authority. Another pause. I would like to make a call. Sera's hand was not entirely steady when she took the card. Greer cleared his throat. Ingrid, we were in the middle of discussing the Series B term sheet. We can return to that. Ingrid's tone was pleasant and absolute. In a moment. The issue is timing. The window on the Bellworth position closes. Preston. Ingrid looked at him then, and her expression was neither unkind nor ambiguous. It was simply accurate. You have just been corrected in Latin by the woman serving your dinner. You have also spent the past hour demonstrating a consistent inability to accurately read the people in a room. She lifted her water glass. Those are not qualities I find reassuring in a partner managing significant capital. She set the glass down. We can discuss the Bellworth position, but I want you to sit with that assessment for a moment first. Greer did not respond. He looked at the table again. The color in his face had moved through several shades in the last 4 minutes and had arrived somewhere in the territory of a man who has felt the ground shift under him and has not yet decided what to do about it. Thomas, the sommelier, appeared to refresh the decanted Barolo, clocked the atmosphere at table 11 with the acuity of a man who had been reading dining rooms for 20 years, silently refilled the glasses, and disappeared. Sera excused herself. She walked back through the service doors into the kitchen, where the noise and heat and the smell of searing duck fat hit her like the opposite of the dining room. She stood at the preparation counter for a moment, with her hands flat on the cold steel surface. The sous chef, a compact, focused woman named Alicia, who never asked questions and always somehow knew when something had happened, slid a small ramekin of the kitchen staff espresso onto the counter beside Sera's hand without a word. Sera drank it. She stood there for a full 60 seconds. Then she went back out. The rest of the service proceeded without incident. Greer was quiet in the way that men are quiet when they are recalculating. Ingrid was warm to Sera in the way that felt like a decision rather than a performance. The younger man, whose name turned out to be Felix and who was apparently a junior analyst at Greer's firm, spent the dessert course looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who had just watched his sense of a situation revise itself entirely. When the party settled the check, Ingrid detained Sera for a moment as the two men retrieved their coats. "I'll make the call to Patricia on Monday," she said quietly. "If you're interested in the fellowship, it would be Cornell, ideally, to complete what you started, but I have a relationship with 2 other programs if the circumstances make that preferable." Sera looked at her. She had not cried in Lumiere in 14 months. She had considered it on perhaps 7 occasions and had decided each time that the carpet was too nice. "I'm interested," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. Ingrid nodded. "I'll need your contact information from Patrick." She glanced toward where Preston Greer was waiting near the host stand, studying his phone with the focused attention of a man who needed somewhere to look. "For what it's worth," she added, her voice dropping just slightly. The Pliny was exactly right. The corner of her mouth moved. "I checked. Once upon a time." She left. The door closed. The room resumed its careful, expensive murmur. Patrick appeared at Sera's elbow with the silent efficiency of someone who had also been doing this for years. "Do I want to know?" "Probably not," Sera said. "Fair." He disappeared. Sera stood for a moment at the edge of the dining room. The candlelight moved. Somewhere across the room, a couple laughed at something private. The string music that Lumiere piped in at a volume calculated to suggest rather than impose drifted across the amber air. She reached into her apron pocket and held Ingrid Solberg's card between her fingers. The embossed letters were distinct under her thumb. "Thea," she thought about her mother, whose hands were shaking more lately, but who still did the crossword every morning in pen, and who had never once in the 14 months since the diagnosis told Sera she was sorry for what this had cost her. Pauline Okafor did not deal of "when you're readied, we'll figure it out." Sera thought they might be getting closer to figuring it out. 3 weeks later, Preston Greer's absence from a key financing close at Greer Aldrich made a single paragraph in a financial trade publication, the kind of paragraph that appeared routine to anyone not reading carefully, and that represented, to anyone who was, the opening act of a longer story. Ingrid Solberg's office had formally notified Greer Aldrich Capital that Dr. Solberg would not be proceeding with the proposed co-investment arrangement, citing strategic misalignment. The Bellworth position that Greer had been so urgent about had been snapped up by a competing fund 6 days before the window closed. In a development he had failed to anticipate because he had been preoccupied with damage control he did not manage to control. Felix, the junior analyst, had quietly submitted a transfer request to another firm by the end of the month. He had been the only person at the table that night who had looked at Sera during the Pliny quote and shown, however briefly, something that looked like recognition. Sera did not follow any of this closely. She had other things to manage. The Ingrid Solberg Foundation's Graduate Completion Fellowship came through in the form of a call from Patricia Fenn on a Wednesday afternoon. Sera was folding napkins in the back prep area of Lumiere, the particular rhythm of it so automatic by now that her hands worked independently of her attention. She almost did not answer the unfamiliar number. She answered it. Patricia said, I heard you quoted Pliny at a hedge fund manager. Pliny the Elder, Sera said. From the natural history, Ingrid told me the whole story, a pause that sounded like a smile. The fellowship is yours if you want it. I would need you back in the fall semester. Your previous coursework carries forward. You'd essentially be picking up where you left off. Sera set down the napkin she was folding. She looked at the wall of the prep area, which was grey cinder block and had a fire safety inspection certificate taped to it. The medical trust, she said, covers immediate family, full coverage, retroactive to the fellowship's start date. Patricia's voice was careful and steady in the way that voices are when they are delivering something they know is significant. Ingrid made sure I understood that piece was non-negotiable. Sera looked at the fire safety certificate. She read the date on it. She did this because she needed to look at something specific while the room rearranged itself around her. I'll be there in the fall, she said. She gave notice at Lumiere the following week. Her manager, a generally undemonstrative man named Gerard, who had hired her in 20 minutes and had never commented on any of her shifts beyond good service, looked at her for a long moment when she handed him the notice letter and said, "Wherever you're going, they're lucky." Sera thought that was possibly the nicest thing anyone had said to her in 14 months. On her last night at Lumiere, she did everything she had done for 14 months. She carried the crystal. She poured without disturbing the sediment. She made herself the right kind of invisible. She smiled with her eyes when her mouth was too tired to mean it, because even on the last night, the guests deserved the service, and Sera Okafor had never once done a thing halfway. But when she untied her apron for the last time and set it on the prep counter, she did not fold it. She left it in a small, imprecise pile on the cold steel surface, and she walked out the back door into the Chicago night, and she did not look back. Her mother called as she was walking to the train. Pauline Okafor, who did not waste words, said, "Patricia Fenn called me today." To introduce herself, she said you were one of the best students she had supervised in 20 years. She might be slightly exaggerating, Sera said. She was not exaggerating, Pauline said. I know when a person is exaggerating. A pause. Come for dinner Sunday. I'll make the groundnut soup. I'll be there, Sera said. She put her phone in her pocket. The train came. She got on. Arrogance, in the end, is just a very expensive way to misread a room, and the rooms that matter are never the ones you think they are.